And yeah, it was disabled, and my Twitter as well was notified when I had my interview at the airport. They brought up like my Twitter account and Instagram and all of that, so that was fun.
Insane.
Okay, we're gonna go. I'm gonna take us live in 3. You guys ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, and just give it a second.
And you're recording.
Perfect. I feel like I can speak now.
Yeah, we are live.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Jamil. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Miko, for coming in for this. I wanted to thank you for answering my incessant DMs. That is how I advise all people who admire someone and their work. Just incessantly DM them. They will reply. So thank you so much for that. For everyone tuning in, I'm Aadila Mahomed. I'm the chairperson of the Stellenbosch University Palestinian Solidarity Forum. It is a human rights society that was created at the end of 2018, just to bring awareness to what is happening in Palestine, the plight of the Palestinian people, the fact that Israel, the illegal acts of Israel, and just show that there is the solidarity in South Africa, even the parts like Stellenbosch, which have a very rich apartheid past and present, one would say. So that's me. And then we're joined by Miko, who is an author, writer, speaker, and human rights activist. He's living in the United States. He's considered by me and by many other people to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine and supporting the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I'm not sure if you want to say a bit more about yourself, Miko.
No, that's good.
Okay, perfect. Then we're just going to jump right into it, just to discuss. We were discussing before this went live. We were discussing how to actually go about so much content in something on a platform like this. And I think to start, especially because most people viewing this are from South Africa, where we do have a collective sense of responsibility, I would say, when it comes to apartheid and injustice, and we should be held to a higher standard of solidarity. Could you maybe give us a bit more context on this, on what has happened for Palestine to end up like this, for there to be such degradation of human rights, for there to be such dismissals of the right to self-determination, and things like that, because it didn't just happen. It was so many things in progress, and it wasn't just from 1948 when Israel achieved independence. So if you could just provide a bit more of a context for us to go forward.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for having me on this program. And the context is really quite simple, really. I mean, settler colonialism, racism that was imported from Europe came to Palestine, and like a terrible disease, started destroying the country, the landscape, expelling people. The Zionists began expelling people in the early 1900s, long before the State of Israel, long before World War II, before World War I, actually, even. So the process was perhaps gradual, but the intent was always very, very clear: to engage in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, of genocide in Palestine, and then to impose a European-style apartheid regime in Palestine, which obviously gives privilege to the white Europeans who happen to be Jewish, at the expense of the Palestinians. So if you were to say it in one sentence, that's really all of it. 1948 was the official start. That was, May of 1948. Yeah. That's when the State of Israel was established. And that's really the official start of the apartheid regime and, obviously the State of Israel. But it's important to remember that prior to that, and going back almost 4,000 years, that country was called Palestine. It was Palestine. It was called Palestine. It has a rich history, a rich heritage, cultural monuments, important religious monuments, and so forth that have existed. And over the last 70 or close to 100 years, actually, like you said, this process of destruction has been taking place.
And it's ridiculous because it only continues by the fact that people, countries, states, governments have not formally declared this formal boycott, divestment, and sanctions against this, because it enables them in that way. But yes, Miko, you were born in Israel, am I right? Yes. Yes, you were born in Israel and you were raised as someone who supports the Zionist ideology. Your father was part of the military and things like that. How, if you don't mind me asking, how and why did your views change? But not even just change like, oh, I see the wrong in this, but change to such a degree that you've become such a significant pro-Palestinian voice.
Well, the way I would describe it, I was born in Palestine. I just didn't know that it was Palestine. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and I was born to a very prominent Zionist patriotic family. My father was a general. My grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I had uncles and aunts who were important people. We had a president in the family, and so on. So I mean, this was as Zionist and as patriotic as you could possibly imagine. And the process through which I grew up, of course, cultivated the patriotism and cultivated the belief and the pride in Zionism and the pride in the role that my family played in establishing the state of Israel. And the separation, the segregation between the occupiers, colonizers, who are my people like me and my family, and the Palestinians is complete, is 100%. So I grew up in Jerusalem, never meeting Palestinians. And South Africa is a big country, so segregation is much easier. Palestine is a very small country. So to create such segregation, it requires a lot of planning, and I have to say, hand it to them, they did a very good job. Now, sadly, I think in life, generally speaking, where the kind of things that make us change our worldview, the kinds of things that force us to examine our beliefs deeply are usually tragic. Usually there's something terrible happen that demands of us to do that. In my case, and I illustrate this in my book, in The General Son, it was the death of my 13-year-old niece in a suicide attack, Palestinian suicide attack in Jerusalem. And thinking about what is it that would bring 3 young men, Palestinians in this case, to kill themselves in such a horrifying way and then take the lives of others. I mean, it's not something that I think we can understand, but we need to pause for a minute and give it some thought. This is not linear. This is not simple. This is not, good and bad. There's something here that's very complex that we need to maybe not understand, but at least give some pause. So that was kind of the beginning of my journey. And then I decided to embark on this journey, which is the subtitle of my book, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, into Palestine, and to see what is Palestine. And that's when I started learning that there's another narrative, that there is a Palestine, that there are Palestinians, and there's, and then you come to a point where you have to make a decision. Because if you're faced with 2 narratives that are completely opposed, that are diametrically opposed, where only one can exist, then you have to make a choice. And how do you make a choice? You make a choice based on your values. And the values that that are important to me, justice, equality, human rights, and so forth, point in the direction of rejecting Zionism. There's no way a person can embrace equality and freedom and democracy and so forth and embrace Zionism at the same time. Because Zionism is a racist ideology. It is a violent ideology. It's an exclusionary ideology. It's settler colonialism. So you have to make a choice, and I had to make a choice, and I had no choice but to reject Zionism and reject the state of Israel completely, and call for changing what is called Israel now back to being Palestine, and create an inclusive state, an inclusive society.
Yeah, and that's very admirable that you're able to kind of unlearn, or not necessarily unlearn, but address what you've been taught in a completely different light. It's extremely admirable, and I feel like it's something so necessary in the world now, because we tend to convey what we are taught without actually doing a follow-up, without actually finding our own reasoning. And I think that's a very prominent thing in the Zionist population today, which brings me on to what I wanted to ask you about. Given the fact that you were raised in that environment, how now do you communicate with people that are Zionists and like remain level-headed and remain true to your values and get through to people like that? Or not, I'm not sure if your aim is always to get through or just to converse, because I know that I'm not sure how it is regarding the media and stuff in Israel, but there must be some level of indoctrination and some level of propaganda and things that's been shown for Zionists to continue thinking that they are living in something that is right and that is respectable and all of that. For example, I got a DM on Instagram from this boy, and I say boy because he looked nothing over the age of 18, in Israel, and all he said was "Long live Israel" in reply to the pro-Palestinian prisoners campaign that we did, that you joined on. And I asked him, I was like, what was the need to send this message if not to provoke? Like, you're sending it to people that have stood up against human rights violations. And then he was like, what do you mean human rights violations? Why do you think we do what we do? We closed the West Bank because of this, because of the bombs. And the fact that he was saying we for actions of the Israeli military made me extremely uncomfortable, because it shows that there's this collective accountability and pride. And I just wonder, how do you communicate with people like that? Because you were obviously surrounded by such.
Well, keeping level-headed is not something I am very good at doing when I'm around that. So, and there's plenty of evidence to that. It's impossible to remain level-headed when you encounter that. But you know, I try. Not always succeed, but I try. But you know, when I'm in Palestine, I actually don't have a lot of contact with people who are that Zionist at that level, although that is the reality. That is Israeli reality. Israeli reality is pride in Zionism, tribal sense of, you know, we do this, we do this, we do this. And there's an indoctrination that leads to that. It doesn't come out of thin air. I mean, the education system is heavily racist. The education system is heavily bent in order to prepare young people to speak just like that young boy you're talking about. And the media too. I mean, Israel has, I don't know how many, a dozen news channels. They all speak the same way. It's just different faces saying the exact same thing over and over and over again. There is no dissent. In the Israeli media, there is no dissent. Not in the newspapers, not on television, not on the radio. Everybody is on the issue of Palestine, toes the line. We are right, they are wrong. They're all anti-Semitic. PDS is anti-Semitic. Palestine solidarity stuff is anti-Semitic. We did nothing wrong. This is who we are. We must do what we do.
It's very much. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's very much propagating this victim mentality and this like scapegoaty mentality. And with that, it begs the question of, can you blame? Like, I know I do, but can you blame the Israeli population for the majority? Because obviously not all Israelis are Zionists, but can you blame them for being Zionist or for being anti-Palestine if that is just continuously what they're taught and what they're conditioned to believe? Because I know in South Africa, if we're going to draw parallels, even today, there's a lot of bitterness and a lot of things that we try not to address when it comes to the denials of apartheid and what role did white people play, did ignorance play, and all of that. So is there that kind of understanding that one should have when addressing Israeli people?
No, there's no room to understand. There's no room to explain. There's no justification. There can be absolutely no justification, no excuse, because what Israel does is not a secret. Everybody knows. It's out there. And anybody who can look at you straight in the eye and say that they justify Israeli acts against Palestinians should be condemned. There's nothing that can possibly justify or excuse what Israel does. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but 2 million people living in a prison, in an open air prison, half an hour drive from Tel Aviv, which is like this wonderful Mediterranean fun city.
Yes, yeah.
You know, without access to clean water, without access to proper medicine, you know, crowded living conditions. 2 million people, more than half
hard to ignore that disparity.
And but more than half of them their homes are not in Gaza Strip, they're refugees. So, you know, they were marching through the Great March of Return and being shot like, you know, by snipers, but they were not doing anything wrong. Their homes are on the other side of that fence. Their rights, their water, their land, it's all on the other side. So they have a right to do that. And to justify and excuse bombing of Gaza, arresting thousands of political prisoners, denying Palestinians water, even when they're Israeli citizens. In other words, this is not only for Palestinians who are back in Gaza. Palestinians who are Israeli citizens are denied the same things. So anybody who can justify that, you know, how could you possibly understand and excuse people who do that and justify that? I don't think there's any room here for understanding or excusing at all.
No, I agree. I just wanted to say, for all of the people that want to ask questions and stuff, please go to the bottom of your screens. There's a Q&A section, and just ask them there, because we will look at the chat, the live chat, but I think it's just going to be a bit more organized if we keep it to the Q&A section, and then we'll address those as we go on. But this question is just stood out to me. The first one is for you, obviously. Do you encounter any problems when you visit Palestine? This person does have many problems raising his voice and speaking up because he's afraid to lose his Palestinian ID. Is that a concern? Does Israel have the power to do that? Because I would not put anything past them at this stage.
Well, the apartheid system that Israel put in place, the level of privilege that I have, I think it's greater than the level of privilege that whites had in South Africa. I think, as far as I know, whites, South Africans who stood with blacks were also arrested and bombed and so forth. Israel doesn't treat Israeli activists like that. I have no problem going in and out, speaking, doing whatever I want to do. There's absolutely no limits on what I do and my ability to travel because of the privilege. So no, I don't have any problem at all.
Well, it's nice that you're able to acknowledge your privilege and actually use it. Whereas in South Africa, we still have people in Stellenbosch, where I'm based, denying white privilege, even though it still is prevalent, and things like that. So it is great to see. I read in your book, you said you were talking about your father after he retired. He was speaking to Palestinian authorities and stuff about not using as much aggression and weaponry and things like that. I'm not sure if I'm misquoting, but what you said, and I wrote this down, was that they believed that you can restrain the settler colonialist project, but you cannot restrain colonialism. You can only overpower it with more power. With that, how does one overpower something like this in this current context, knowing what we know about the plight of the Palestinians, the lack of access to everything, the lack of respect and right and recognized rights? What power do they have to even use to overpower it? What power does the rest of the world have in this sense?
Yeah, my father was one of the pioneers of this idea of a two-state solution as we know it today, where somehow the state of Israel will remain on 80% of Palestine, and in the West Bank and Gaza, which make up 22% of the land, the Palestinians would be permitted to create their own little state under conditions that Israel imposes, and that this would somehow work. Colonialism has an insatiable appetite. You can't stop it and say, okay, well, we're going to stop it, the racism here, and from here to here, we're going to have a tiny little haven for Palestinians to be happy. That's not how it works. You either reject Zionism, which my father and that whole group of kind of liberal leftist Zionists never did. You either reject Zionism or you accept Zionism. And this is a conversation that takes place even today. Some people think that you can accept Zionism, but also be nice and liberal and friendly. Well, that's not how it works. Now, what power do the Palestinians have? I think, look, Palestinians had, before the Nakba, before 1948, and throughout, you know, the 1,000, 1,500 years, had built monuments and cities and towns and a culture and a heritage that was impressive. Cities like Haifa and Akka and Tabariya, and look at the, not to mention Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. I mean, trade and commerce and agriculture. I mean, they created a beautiful country with enormous achievements. That was all, you know, that's been destroyed, and not all of it, but much of it is being destroyed as we speak, and has been. So, I mean, Palestinians have a lot of strength. Palestinians are not weak people. Palestinians are fighters. They don't, you know, I always say they don't need our,
resilient, yeah.
They don't need our sympathy. They need our solidarity and to join the struggle. We on the outside were given a gift by the Palestinians in 2005 called BDS, the Call for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. That is the gift we were given by Palestinians, because it's a very clear statement as to what needs to be done and what the objectives are. In other words, it's not just boycott, divestment, and sanctions and whatever. It's boycott, divestment, and sanctions until 3 very clear, very well-defined goals are achieved, demands are achieved. Ending the military occupation, equal rights, and the return of the refugees. You know, so I mean, we have the power to do that. I mean, every country has the power to do that. Every person who votes for their government, for the legislature, has the power to influence. Every person who goes to the store and buys and has the choice to not buy Israeli products and make a statement and protest and so forth has the power. I mean, can you imagine? And like you said earlier, people in South Africa know that because that was the experience that they had. I mean, it wasn't an easy struggle. They fought long and hard to get to the point where people joined the struggle. But we have the power to do that, absolutely. And if we move, the harder we work, the more aggressive and dedicated we are, the faster we will see results, and the faster we will see it from Palestine.
I think a big issue with BDS, because obviously it's something that has been shown to be, it's been proven to work, it's been proven to be necessary, and all of that. I think there's quite a few different types of boycotts that need to take place. It's not just food and like fruits that you see at this store in this store. It's you're boycotting a mentality, a colonialist mentality. You're boycotting so many different things. And I know a big concern, I wouldn't call it a concern, a big part of that is academic boycotts. And in South Africa, there's been quite a few chances for an academic boycott, especially for UCT, because their pro-Palestinian voice is extremely strong and extremely significant. And I think they almost succeeded, but I'm not sure now what's actually happening and how messy everything has gotten. I know in Stellenbosch, that is a very far-fetched aim. It is an aim, but an extremely far-fetched aim. What do you think is the significance of an academic boycott of universities, of academia published, of things like that?
Yes, the argument that usually people bring up is, well, academia, you know, these are liberal people. It's an opportunity
academic freedom,
work, and so forth. Well, in the case of Israeli academia, that is not the case. That is not true. And I'll give you two examples. One is Israeli universities, Israeli academics work with the Israeli military, with the Israeli secret police, with the entire defense apparatus, I should say, all the time. They collaborate with them all the time on every level. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if these academics are so liberal, if they're so caring, where are they? University of Tel Aviv sits on several destroyed Palestinian villages. Okay, where is the demand that the people whose homes were there be compensated? Why are they demanding that? 30 minutes from Tel Aviv, an hour from Jerusalem, is the Gaza Strip. Where are all these academics in the University of Jerusalem, and the Hebrew University, and the University of Tel Aviv, other universities that demand that Israel immediately lift the siege on Gaza, a siege that is cruel and is brutal and has absolutely no justification whatsoever and cannot be excused in any way, shape, or form? Where are the hundreds of thousands of students and academia and scholars and professors? Why are they not in the streets demanding that Israel immediately release all the political prisoners, especially now with the coronavirus spreading?
Yes.
Where are they?
Yeah.
So they're not there. They don't exist. They're not there on this issue. And so if you're not there on this issue, then there's absolutely no reason in the world why they should be exempt from BDS. In fact, they should be supporting BDS. They should be the first one to say, we support BDS. Same thing in the Nakab. There's the Beersheba University. In the Nakab, the ethnic cleansing that took place in the Nakab and continues to take place in the Nakab, and the horrible conditions under which the Palestinians in the Nakab, the Bedouin Palestinians, are treated. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians without access to water, and these are Israeli citizens. So where is that academia? Where are they? Where are these cultural icons? Where are these academic, all these humanitarians? They don't exist.
They don't exist. Yeah.
So in the case of Israel, this argument is ridiculous. It has no foundation whatsoever.
Just going, just backpacking off of what you said about when you mentioned the coronavirus, and especially with the Palestinian prisoners, political prisoners, and the conditions that they're being kept in. We have like the Palestinian Prisoners Day attention being brought to that on that day, but since then there hasn't, as far as I know, there hasn't been much or enough of a step forward by Israel. They haven't actually said anything publicly. They haven't made any announcements or made any submissions to international law that came about regarding prisoners amidst the virus.
Look, Israel is not going to change anything until it all collapses. This notion that somehow we can have a campaign for prisoners, have a prisoners' day, and the next day Israel will change is absurd. This notion that we can have a campaign to end the siege on Gaza, which there are several campaigns all the time, and that somehow Israel will wake up in the morning and say, you know what, they're right. That's not going to happen. No part of Palestine is going to be free. No aspect of the Palestinian tragedy is going to end until Israel collapses. The only way to bring an end to the siege on Gaza, to the imprisonment of thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails, to the enormous human rights violations, and on and on and on, and the destruction of Palestine, by the way, and the destruction of monuments, is to bring down the apartheid regime and replace it with a democracy. That is the only way it will end. And once it's brought down, then we begin the building. You know what I mean? Yes. Once it's brought down, and once you have a real democracy in place, and you've seen this in South Africa too. Nelson Mandela became president, everybody was happy, but that's when the hard work begins. Yeah. That's when you have to start doing the real work. So that's when things will happen. It won't be any different in Palestine. It has to be a concerted effort, a dedicated effort to bring down the apartheid regime and replace it with a real democracy. That is the only thing that will change anything.
I love how I was like, how do you remain level-headed when discussing this issue? And you're like, bring down the Israeli regime. That is how I remain level-headed.
Level-headed is not something.
It doesn't get things done. I don't think it gets things done. It gets things done. Looking at the questions on the Q&A, I just wanted to go quickly to that. I'm not sure if you can access it, but I'll just read them out. One of the questions is, does BDS for Khalil Karwa does BDS are they still active in South Africa? Because he read a Jewish report that they are no longer part of the international BDS movement and had to change their names. I can just speak on this because BDS in South Africa, BDS South Africa changed their name to the BDS Coalition in South Africa, and they still exist. BDS in itself does still exist in South Africa. The older BDS just changed to Africa for Palestine. And I think that's caused a lot of confusion unnecessarily, but BDS is still very relevant and active in South Africa. Then regarding other questions, we're going to discuss the solutions, what we think could be solutions a bit later on. But I was looking at different questions on the way forward and different views on the way forward, because it's not just a one-state or two-state solution that people put forward. And when it's a one-state solution, people often then are like, okay, but now does one entire group have to be annihilated, which is not viable a lot of the time. So what is your opinion on the one-state solution, seeing as it is a solution where one would have to erase all the borders, the borders that have been put in place by this colonialist regime, and put Israelis and Palestinians together? That is my very basic understanding of a one-state solution. And then there's a two-state solution where you'd have both the Palestinians and Israelis having their own independent states, and whether or not this is actually still a possibility, because I would argue that it is impossible to have a state with someone or even next to someone if those people do not regard you as worthy enough of human rights, of self-determination, things like that.
Yeah, a two-state solution is a myth. There is no two states. There's never any intention. There's never any design. There's not even a possibility, because the Zionist, one of the founding Zionist principles is that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. The state of Israel is really more like a caretaker. The land belongs to the Jewish people, all Jewish people in Stellenbosch, in Los Angeles, everywhere. You know, that's so there's no room for compromise here. This is Zionism, and that the rights that Jewish people have supersedes any rights that Palestinians might have. So there's no way to have a Jewish state in Palestine without negating the rights of Palestinians. There's no way to do that. Any form of a Jewish state or a Chinese state or any other state in Palestine will inevitably clash with Palestinian rights because it is Palestine. So what we have today is a single state over all of Palestine, and that has been the reality for decades. A single state over all of Palestine, which is the state of Israel. It's an apartheid regime. And not only is it an apartheid regime, it's a more complex in many ways apartheid regime than South Africa was, because not only do Israeli Jews like myself have privileges that Palestinians are denied, but Palestinians are designated a status depending on where specifically they reside. So if they are in certain parts of Palestine, they have this quasi citizenship. If they're in Jerusalem, Jerusalemite Palestinians, they have a different status. If they live in what used to be the West Bank and these colonies, you know, in these Bantustans that Israel created, these prisons, then they have a certain status. And of course, if they're people that live in the Gaza Strip. So, and of course, you've got the Palestinians on the outside who have no right to return. Refugees who have no right to return, and you know what I mean, because Israel has banned them. So Israel has placed Palestinians on kind of a totem pole, and their status is determined by where they specifically live. But it is a single state. Every single person who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea lives under the governance of the state of Israel. However, only Jewish Israelis have a right to vote. Only Jewish Israelis have a right to say, and a minority of Palestinians that have a right to vote. But
which completely disproves the myth of Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. Because
democracy unless you're Jewish.
It's not a democracy, yeah.
It's not a democracy if you're an Israeli Jew. Israeli Jews do have a democracy for themselves, but they're not there, but they're the minority. The majority of the population. So really, the one state, two state question is not a real question, because and the whole idea of a two state accepts the Zionist, it's part of the Zionist paradigm that we should reject anyway. There's a single state in Palestine. The question is this: do we support a racist, violent apartheid regime that is engaged in violence and genocide and ethnic cleansing and destruction of monuments and the destruction of Palestinian culture? Or do we fight for democracy with equal rights that will allow the Palestinian refugees to return, that will be inclusive? Those are the two options, and it's got nothing to do with politics. This has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with our values. Where do you feel? That's what happened to me. You check your values. Where do you stand? Do you support this or do you support that? And wherever you fall, that's kind of where that is. That's why there's no room really for debates and dialogue and arguments, because you can't argue values. If somebody thinks it's okay to kill a child, that's their value. You know what I mean? There's nothing to argue. So that is the conversation. It's not one state, two state. It's the nature of the state of Palestine, apartheid or democracy.
I think that's a very important thing to just emphasize, because I know in Stellenbosch, when we have our events or fairs and stuff, and we have like the pro-Palestine stall, we get quite a bit of backlash, and we have quite a few people come and heckle us which is very entertaining for the most part because they don't have a basis for their argument. All they're taught is what their parents have taught them, which is racism, which is fine. We can debate that. But a lot of it is just because what we need to make clear, especially in a place where it's a very contentious issue, is that it's not about the politics here. It's not about the religion. It's not about all of these different things that could blur the lines between right and wrong. It's a very clear thing of just look at the human rights violations. Look at your values. Look at if you do stand by that, then fine. You can go to be pro-Zionism. But as soon as you entertain discussions about the religious claim and land and all of this stuff, you blur those lines and it becomes very, very dangerous.
And you know, the Zionist claim to Palestine is one that, by the way, is rejected by many Jewish people, including the Orthodox religious Jewish people.
Yes.
Reject this claim. But the claim is that really Jews have not been in Palestine for 2,000 years, and therefore they have a right to be there now at the expense of Palestinians who actually were there, developed the country, built cities, built town, built an industry and agriculture and monuments. Excuse me? The Jews have not been there for 2,000 years, and therefore they have a right to be there, because maybe all Jewish people today are descendants of a tribe that used to live in parts of Palestine 3,000 years ago. Excuse me, how does anybody even entertain this ridiculous argument that they have a right that supersedes the right of the people who were there, who are there, who can trace their Palestinians in Jerusalem can trace their ancestors going back to Salah ad-Din? You know, what are we even talking about? It's an absurd proposition. And like I said, Jewish people, there are many Jewish people who reject it as well. But that is the foundation of their argument, that they have a right because they were not there for 2,000 years.
Well, that's a poor argument at best. But when I put this event on Instagram, I had a few other Israeli people, not Israeli, Zionist people message me, and they were like, "Can we send questions? But we're not going to tune into the interview." And I was like, "Okay, well that seems logical, but sure." And then they sent me a question saying, "Do Palestinians not have their own government?" And in brackets, "because I know they do, and they not control their own lives?" Brackets, "because I know they do." So already that question was framed very badly. But the question of Palestinians having their own government already and being in control of their own lives, I think you've already dismissed that by saying from the river to the sea, it's all under the Israeli government. It's all under that military occupation.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying, in the fact that like so many people in Israel do not see that as wrong, do not see it as unjustifiable.
No, Israelis know the truth. They just think it's okay. And then they've developed all these ridiculous arguments to justify what they think is okay, but with a wink. You know what I mean? They know it's not okay, but they pretend it is. And then they bring you all these arguments about King David and this and David and Goliath and all these different myths that exist in order to justify. And then, of course, the whole myth of Palestinian terrorism, as though there was such a thing as Palestinian terrorism, and so on and so forth. You know, this is the argument. It's an argument that is baseless, that has no foundation whatsoever in reality or in the truth.
That's, yeah, agreed, 100%. Just looking at the questions of from the Q&A, Aadila Mahomed, he's a Palestinian who lives in South Africa at the moment. He asked, "Do you, Miko, what do you think of the One Democratic State campaign that started in Haifa in 2018?
Yeah, there's several one-state campaigns. I think they're all good. I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to be campaigning for the day after to start planning this single state, single democracy that I believe is inevitable to come up in Palestine, because a single state is a reality. A single state is not disputable. It's not something we can change. That is the reality that Palestine, that has existed in Palestine for decades, and that is how it's going to stay. That's the way it is. Now, the nature of the state has to be defined by someone, and there are several campaigns. The one he mentioned is one of them, that starts to plan a constitution and then the legal rights and the process by which refugees will be allowed to return. I mean, these are important things that need to be debated, need to be discussed. Reparations, you know, for Palestinians who who have been kicked out of their homes and their lands and their public spaces and so forth. So yes, these campaigns, I'm part of many of these campaigns, and I think they're very important.
Can I ask, just because all of these campaigns have to do with getting rid of the occupation at their core, what classifies Israel's presence? This is like I do know this, but I think it would be important to just have it for the public. What classifies Israel's presence in places like the West Bank? What classifies that as an occupation?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't use the term occupation anymore. Because when people say occupation, it kind of limits the conversation to a few small parts of Palestine. You know, they say the West Bank, but really there's no more West Bank. The West Bank has ceased to exist. It's been integrated into the rest of Israel, into the Israeli system, except for these pockets of Bantustan Palestinian areas. And of course, and the Gaza Strip. Well, that's only 22% of Palestine, even less, because what's left of the West Bank is very little. But I think we need to look at Palestine as a whole. All of Palestine has been subjected to settler colonialism. All of Palestine is subjected to an apartheid regime. Even though Palestinians have different status depending on where they live, it's still an apartheid regime. No Palestinian anywhere in Palestine has the same rights as I do when I'm there. None. That does not exist. Okay, so it's an apartheid regime. In terms of the ethnic cleansing, in terms of the destruction of Palestinian towns and villages, it doesn't matter if a town is in the West Bank, in the Galilee, or in the Nakab, everything is being destroyed. Monuments are being destroyed. Israel is trying to take over as much land and get rid of as many Palestinians as possible throughout the entire country. So the distinction of these parts are under military rule, like these Bantustans. This part is under this rule. This part is under that. These are all distinctions that Israel created for its own bureaucratic purposes. But I don't think we should give it any kind of legitimacy. All of Palestine must be freed, and must be freed without, without any exceptions, and immediately.
Okay, no, that makes sense. It's just very shocking to see how it's got into that stage of like, what would be an occupation of a small part is now an entire country, an entire population being dispossessed. But just going to the Q&A, sorry, I'm like squinting at my screen. Rishad Dadu said that in South Africa, civil society played a major role in pressuring the apartheid government towards negotiations. Is there any likelihood that the average Israeli family will come to the realization that not only are they living under an unjust and racist regime, but that they have a duty to oppose the system, which you did touch on obviously earlier when you were discussing the collective responsibility. But if you want to just...
Well, Israelis do not live under an unjust regime. Israelis are the oppressors. Israelis are the ones who are imposing the unjust regime.
Yes,
and like I said, for Israelis, Israel is a democracy. So the people who are governing, the people who are imposing these policies, the people who are bombing and arresting and torturing and destroying, were voted into office by Israelis who voted for them. In other words, you can't make this distinction, oh, Israelis are one thing and their government is another. No, Israelis vote in very high numbers. The governments that we've seen in Israel from the very beginning all the way to this day have been violent, racist, oppressive governments, and that hasn't changed. So Israelis have never been persecuted, have never lived under an oppressive regime. They've always been the oppressor. To expect that a privileged, oppressive society will one day wake up and feel good and say, you know what, we were wrong, let's all be friends, is not realistic. Israelis will change. Israelis will demand change when they suffer, when they can no longer travel overseas, when they can no longer participate in the Olympics or in the World Cup, when they can no longer come to other universities and participate in academic or cultural events, where they cannot sell their products, where they have nowhere to go. That's when they will demand change. That's when privileged societies change, when they're brought to their knees. And then, I was bringing the example of South Africa. South Africa ended up having Nelson Mandela as president. You know what? That's not bad. You know what I mean? Most countries would die.
That was our peak.
To have somebody, of course, somebody like that. So, I mean, the next day Israelis are going to wake up when Zionism collapses and there's a one person, one vote elections. and there's a legislature and a government that represents all the people. And they have a Palestinian prime minister, and their kids go to school with Palestinian kids. They're going to get up in the morning. They're going to realize the sky hasn't fallen. They're going to send their kids to school. They're going to go to work, and they're going to go on with their days and their life, you know, and it's going to be better for everyone. But it won't happen until they are on their knees. That is the nature of privileged racist societies.
But that also wouldn't, once that happens, wouldn't it be safe to say that Zionism then does not exist at all? Because Zionism, like you said, has no boundaries, has no limits. It is greed. So to have a one-state solution and to have that kind of future that you described, Zionism then would cease to exist?
Must cease to exist, of course. Zionism must cease to exist. Zionism is the plague. Zionism is the apartheid. Zionism is the apartheid ideology.
A lot of the support for Zionism has come in the fact that Israel feels like they are under threat and under attack constantly. They're in the state of defense. That is why it justifies them to violate so many human rights and all of that. So is there, while I can say no, that's not true and all of this, how can Israel keep their citizens safe while also not violating the human rights of Palestinians? Obviously, I know that it's possible, but for people that are saying it's an either or, how do you rationalize it for them?
Well, the existence of Israel is a violation of international law and the violation of Palestinian rights. You know, yesterday there was a raid in one of the towns in the West Bank, and there was a raid. They came in to arrest a bunch of Palestinians, and one of the Israeli soldiers was killed. Palestinian threw a big rock or a brick from the top of the floor right on his head and killed him. A young guy, I don't know, 20 years old.
Sorry to interrupt you, because I think that this will link to your answer. There's a woman, Vivian Myberg. I'm pretty sure she's a Zionist on Stellenbosch campus. Hi, Vivian. We've missed you at a few of our events. She's a very vocal Zionist. She asked, what about Arab Israelis? They can also vote and are even in the Israeli parliament. Israel is not only made up of Israeli Jews, as you imply. Jews can trace their ancestors back to the land over 3,000 years ago. Does that not count for anything?
Hold on.
That is definitely directed at you, because Vivian does not ask me questions ever.
Okay, those are like many questions, but let me finish my point. A soldier was killed, a young man was killed yesterday by Palestinians. Now, Israelis are, all in mourning, and as they should be, a young man was killed. But the young man was part of a military unit that conducted a raid to arrest Palestinians. You know what I mean? Nobody can expect to be safe as long as Israel exists, because Israel is a violation of international law, a violation of Palestinian rights, and Palestinians have the right to fight. The Israeli violence has no justification. Palestinian resistance is sanctioned by international law and by human rights. So you cannot blame Palestinians when they respond to Israeli violence. Granted, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance has not been armed, but still, when an Israeli soldier, an Israeli settler is killed, everybody's mourning and crying and saying all this. Well, what do you expect? I mean, when you impose violence on other people, then that's what happens. The one question that she asked a whole bunch of different questions. The one that
should I repeat it?
No, not necessarily. The one that she said about Jews having a history of 3,000 years in Palestine. Well, first of all, what is her last name?
Myberg.
And Myberg is what kind of a name? Where does it come from?
South Africa.
Where did her family come from?
She's not Jewish. She is not personally Jewish. She's part of a Christian Zionist.
Okay, well, let me school her then. That the vast majority of Jewish people, there's not a single, I don't know actually, of a single Jewish person on earth that can actually trace their family back to Palestine. Very, very few. I mean, there were Palestinian stuff. There was a very small Jewish community in Palestine for, going back several hundreds of years. But there's not a single Jewish family on earth that can trace their roots back to Palestine. actually their family. They say, yes, well, the Bible. Well, the Bible is a book of faith. It's not a history book. It's a book that's full of mythology. Now, Palestinian, if you take a group of Israeli children and a group of Palestinian children, ask the Israelis, where's your family from? They're going to say Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, America, South Africa. Ask Palestinians whether they live in Palestine or whether they're refugees. Where are you from? They're going to say Jaffa, Akka, Haifa, Hebron, Jerusalem. Which of these two nations is connected to Palestine and actually has roots in Palestine? You know, if you look at my family's last name, I can guarantee you there's not a single gene in my gene pool that has any connection to Palestine whatsoever. That doesn't mean they're not Jewish. Being Jewish is a completely other issue. It's a completely other thing. Having direct links and rights in Palestine is a stretch.
Okay, no, I think that suffices as an answer for her questions. I'm looking at the Q&A section, and I'm just, oh my god, I lost my place, sorry. Someone asked on your opinion regarding the deal of the century. What are your minds of that?
The deal of the century was, I believe, written by the Israeli government and executed and kind of put forward by the Americans. But it was Zionists who put it together in collusion with the Israeli government. And it's basically a demand for Palestinians to surrender and accept that Israel has all the rights to all of Palestine, including the control of the resources and the land and the people and everything that goes with that. That's what the deal of the century is. There's nothing there that could even remotely be accepted. It is it's a complete demand of Palestinians to capitulate. And there's no reason to accept it, discuss it. It's not even worth rejecting. It is not even worth discussing.
That's quite sad that it was put forward by a government that we're supposed to look up to and that's supposed to set the standard for the rest of the world. But here we are.
Talking about the American government?
Well, American and Israeli governments are at this moment the same, one and the same.
Well, they talk about the fact that they have shared values. And when we look at the history of the United States, we see genocide, slavery, dropping nuclear bombs, mass murder of innocent civilians all over the world. You know, so those are the values that the US and Israel share.
Yes, definitely. Just looking at more of these questions, someone asked, do you think that Israel has done anything good at all? Ever?
No.
I
don't know what that means, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what they expect. Someone asked regarding so we were looking at one-state solution and two-state solutions. Someone said, would you support Palestine not existing at all, but Gaza being absorbed into Egypt and the West Bank being absorbed into Jordan, and then obviously leaving Israel to be its own state?
Well, it's not for me to accept or not accept. It's for the Palestinians to accept or not accept. And I don't.
Do you think that's a viable?
Of course not. Palestinians are Palestinians. Their land is Palestine. They belong in Palestine, and the land belongs to them. The whole idea of Israel, this Zionist project, is a foreign occupation. It has no place in Palestine, and it should be removed. Now, the fact that today you've got some 6 million Israelis, Israelis like myself, we're like the whites in South Africa. We're not organic. We don't belong there. We're not from there. We are the result of settler colonialism. And so that is the reality. But now they're there. Like there's such a thing as white Africans today, right? In South Africa. There is such a thing as Israelis in Palestine today. That's the reality. That can't be changed unless some of them decide to get up and go back to where they came from. But that's not likely to happen. And so we have a reality where we have in Palestine this new creation, this new thing called Israelis, and the indigenous Palestinian people. And the only way to move forward, if we believe in justice and human rights, is through a state that is a democratic state that provides equal rights and a one person, one vote. That's the only way to go. Everything else is just trying to justify and fabricate some kind of a reality that will allow Israel to continue.
But as you said, they won't ever be satisfied with any kind of compromise, because that is not in the ideology of Zionism.
It's an impossibility, yeah. It's an impossibility.
Yes. So basically what we can take away from this is that the only way forward is through severe boycott, divestment, sanctions. It needs to be a globally backed movement. And that's something that it takes a lot of mental and emotional energy from a person, especially when you think about all the other things happening in the world that distract people from what's happening in places like Palestine. If you think about what's happening in Kashmir, in Syria, in China with the Uyghur Muslims, there's always going to be something wrong. There's always going to be some injustices. There's always going to be human rights violations. How do you advise that people remain steadfast, I would say, when it comes to the struggle of Palestine? International people, not Palestinians, because obviously they are very involved.
Well, I don't think there's all these struggles are they can live together. You can support justice in Palestine and justice in China and justice in everywhere else. The thing about Palestine is, I believe that, like South Africa, Palestine is an issue that is defining our generation. And when I say our generation, I'm talking about not a particular generation, but I'm talking about everybody who's alive today. This is going to define, and it does define, all of us. All of our children and our grandchildren are going to look back at us one day and say, well, where did you stand on this? Just like in South Africa, when people talk about apartheid, people look back at everybody and say, so where did you stand? Did you stand out there demanding, to free Nelson Mandela? Did you stand out there to demand and then to apartheid, or did you go and support apartheid? This is something that's going to define us, and our children are going to look back and ask us about this. Future generations. Where did you stand, and how did you fight in order to bring justice to Palestine? That's the nature of Palestine. That's the nature of this issue, of this problem. Now, again, if you stand for justice, you stand for justice everywhere. I mean, there's no conflict here at all. Obviously, people pick the struggles that they pick based on their values, but I strongly believe that the issue of Palestine is relatively simple to resolve. We've seen it resolved in the past. You don't have to invent anything new. We've seen people repatriated. We've seen apartheid regimes and other dark regimes fall. We know what needs to be done. We know what it looks like the day after if things are done well. It's not something that's difficult, that's that complicated at all. And if we put our heads together, and if we work together, and if we expand the struggle, if we organize and educate to a point where more and more people participate, then this can be resolved, I believe, relatively quickly, and much quicker than most people think. So there's no conflict here between this and other struggles.
Linking again back to the Q&A, and Anissa Nain asked, Miko, what is your stance on Israeli journalists like Haaretz and 972 Mag? Do they get any respect among Israelis?
Haaretz is a Zionist, is kind of a liberal Zionist publication. It's more Zionist than liberal. There are two journalists that write there that are critical of the state of Israel, but that's it. They're the only two journalists, really.
Oh my gosh.
And very few Israelis actually read it. It's a generation of my parents that read Haaretz, and they're dwindling away. And a bunch of people overseas that like, liberals who like to read it, who look at it online. 972 is a completely different operation. This is an operation that is much more progressive, of course. So it's very, very different. They're not the same. Haaretz is a dying breed.
Okay. Just regarding like the fact that you said that to deal with this and to get through this, we need to educate and expand the boycott, divestment, sanction, expand the response to the struggle. That also comes in educating and communicating with people that we don't necessarily always agree with and that have different views. So someone asked, linking to that, do you speak Hebrew and do you speak to the Israeli society in hopes of maybe achieving something?
I speak Hebrew. Hebrew is my mother tongue. I was born and raised as an Israeli, so obviously I speak Hebrew, of course. It's my first language. But I don't speak to Israeli audiences because I'm not invited to Israeli audiences. Israeli,
Why?
well, because they don't want this conversation. They're not going to organize a webinar about how we are going to undo Zionism. That's not how Israeli society thinks. Israeli society is Zionist and racist. They don't want to have this conversation at all, you know, and so
Yes.
that's not something that's realistic, no.
Yeah, agreed. One of the questions is from Aadila Mahomed. With the current status quo of US support for Israel and the ongoing settlements and violation of Palestinian rights, and Israel ignoring any international condemnation from the UN, etc., what could be the catalyst of this change and the collapse of the current Israeli government? I know we discussed this a bit before we went live. Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows what it's going to be?
Both of us were just stumped.
No, the issue, first of all, is not the Israeli government. It's the state of Israel. These are two different things. What we need to see is the collapse of the state, but who knows what it's going to be? It could be something internal. The state of Israel itself is in the process of self-destruction anyway. The healthcare system is bankrupt. The education system is bankrupt. The military, other than being able to bomb the entire world with nuclear weapons, is really a very poor military force. I mean, they know how to do policing, but they're not really military. They're an occupation force, which is a very different thing. And the justice system is politicized and corrupt. So the state itself is crumbling from within. I mean, I think we could just, even if we sat back and did nothing, we would see the whole thing implode. I don't want to sit around and do nothing. I think we should push it in that direction. I think we can do everything. We need to do everything we can. But the state itself is in a state of decay. There's no question about that.
Someone asked, what do you, they want to know if you do in fact have a solution for the Middle Eastern problem, because you talk about how it can be resolved, but how actually can it be resolved? And I think you've mentioned quite a few times about the fact that like you have to completely reject Zionism as a whole and reject that with boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But how do we implement that?
Well, I don't know what the Middle East problem is. So
yeah, I was just like, this could be referring to a lot of things.
A big thing. I know about Palestine, and I know what I think about Palestine, and I believe that the issue of Palestine can be resolved quite easily with people joining the effort to impose boycott, divestment, sanctions, and isolate the state of Israel and bring it down and replace it with a real democracy. I think that's the way to go. Could
I give a suggestion of what I think the Middle Eastern problem that is being referred to is that not the fact that like Zionism is being seen as the kind of security system for the state, for the Israelis, of the Israeli state. So maybe the Middle Eastern problem is the threat imposed by the other countries surrounding it, because I know that's a very prominent argument. But
a threat to whom?
To Israel. Israeli state.
There are no threats to Israel from the outside. It's a myth. There are no threats. You know, the most Arab countries do business with Israel anyway. Most of the regimes, like all other regimes around the world, do business with Israel. Muslim countries do business with Israel as well, because it profits them. I mean, I don't believe there's such a thing as a Middle East threat, one way or the other. But I do believe that any positive influence that leads in the way of democracy, equal rights, will be good for everybody. It'll be good for the whole region. Of course, I believe in Palestine is free and democratic. It will have a good impact on the entire region. There's no question.
Before we went live, we discussed Bernie and Biden and the different stances, and the fact that Biden is a Zionist. But someone asked if Bernie would be elected, do you think he'll interact in favor of the Palestinians? However, he can't be elected now because he gave in to Biden. But do you think that if he were elected, and the policies that he could have put in place regarding what he, if they correlate to what he said about US aid and stuff to Israel, do you think it would have gotten to the point of, like, do you think it was a possibility for Palestinian rights to be recognized and go further from that?
You know, whether politicians do what they promise to do once they get elected or not, that's a big question. And most of the time they don't. However, I think that having said what he said, he is criticizing Israel for killing thousands of people in Gaza. What he said about the need to condition aid to Israel with Israeli compliance with international law. If somebody with these positions was to become the president of the United States, that would be a game changer, there's no question, because that would change the entire political paradigm in the United States. The paradigm here in the United States is if you cannot be elected unless you're Zionist, unless you support Israel. And to see, first of all, I think to see somebody come that close to become president is already a sign that there's change in the air. And that change, really, you have to credit student organizations, the student activists on campuses in the US and so forth for the incredible work that they do, just like you do in Stellenbosch, they're doing here in the United States. And that is what actually pushed the bar up and up and up till it reached somebody like Sanders. So that is, I believe, already progress. However, he's obviously stopped short. But if somebody with those views was able to become president, there's no question that would be a game changer. And the same thing in the UK. If Jeremy Corbyn was elected prime minister, that would have been a huge change in the entire paradigm, in the entire structure of the relations with Israel and the Palestinian issue, which is why Israel was absolutely dedicated to bringing him down. There was no way they were going to allow a Jeremy Corbyn to become prime minister of the United Kingdom. They would have done anything to make sure that doesn't happen, and of course they succeeded. They acted here in the United States with Sanders as well, although Sanders was not as progressive as Corbyn. But still, I think the fact that two things: one, the fact that we got so close, both in the UK and in the United States, to have a candidate that, with these views, comes so close to leading these governments is a sign of progress. But also it shows just how dedicated the Zionists are in not allowing that to happen.
Yeah. Someone asked, if the current annexation plans go forward, will it simply hasten the inevitable struggle for human and equal rights for all in a single state? I'm truly wondering whether that is better or worse, the better or worse option at this point. Another 50 years of occupation with no rights and no viable state doesn't seem very possible anymore.
Well, on the ground, in de facto annexation, official annexation or no official annexation makes no difference whatsoever on the ground to Palestinians. The reality is doesn't change. It just gives it some kind of an international, and it gives more kind of a stance or a position of officialness to the Israelis who settled in what used to be the West Bank. But in terms of the rights of Palestinians, it makes no difference one way or the other. The entire project, the entire project of Zionism is about displacing Palestinians, taking their land, and doing everything possible to make their lives impossible. Look at the Negev desert. The Negev, not the desert. It's not only a desert, but the Negev, the southern part of Palestine. The Palestinian Bedouins, some 250,000 of them. These are the indigenous people of the Negev, of Palestine. They are citizens of Israel. They have no access to clean water. They live in horrible conditions, while all around them, Israeli colonies are thriving. One of the four richest cities, Israeli cities, is in the Negev desert, right next to a township of Palestinian Bedouins where there's poverty and no employment and so forth. So it doesn't matter if they decide officially to annex this or decide officially to annex that. The process of taking away Palestinian land and building colonies for Israelis only at the expense of Palestinians is an ongoing process that will never stop unless Israel is stopped.
I'm looking at the questions again, and there's one that I want to just keep for the end about what we can do specifically to help, but like being quite specific, that was emphasized. But before that, someone asked, saying that you say that the only solution is the destruction of Israel. If that is so, then what is the difference between destroying Israel and destroying Palestine? If it comes to the point where the government is led by the Palestinians, what would then happen to Israeli Zionists?
Destroy.
They mustn't
I
exist.
don't think I said the word destroy. I said dismantle and transform it into a democracy. The difference is this: Israel has been, since its establishment, destroying, literally, physically destroying cities, towns, villages, homes, historic monuments, ancient cemeteries, churches, mosques, hospitals, schools, again and again and again, forcing millions of people to live in squalor and refugee camps, taking away their rights, denying water to the ones who are still there. Israel has been bombing and killing thousands and thousands and thousands from the air, from the sea. That is the destruction of Palestine, and it's taking place every single day as we speak right now for almost 100 years. That is the destruction that is taking place right now. What I'm talking about, and what most Palestinians are talking about, is stopping that destruction, halting the process of destroying Palestine, halting the process of the spread of the Zionist state into all parts of Palestine, and reversing as much as possible so that Palestinians can return to their lands and their homes and live safely, and create a political environment where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and equality. That is not destruction. That is improvement for everyone. So when people say, oh, you want to destroy Israel, to destroy is what Israel is doing. To create a democracy with equal rights that grants Palestinians the same privileges as Israeli Jews have in Palestine is not destruction. This will benefit everyone. Everyone.
And I think that links, yes, yeah. And I think that links to the what you were saying earlier about dismantling the settler colonialist mindset that contains even in Israel today, because you have to dismantle that mindset to be able to live alongside someone so that they can respect your right to live, your right to exist in the same land as them, which I think is the core issue here. But just before we wrap up, I know there's quite a few questions. I think one important one going forward is just what can we do specifically to help, what can we do going forward when it comes to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but how do we tackle this in our own spaces?
Well, you find the nearest campaign, you find the nearest group. If you're in South Africa, that's not hard, but depending on where you are, if there isn't one in your local neighborhood, in your city, in your college, then establish one. Start educating, organize, identify campaigns, go to bdsmovement.org, go to the website and see what they're doing. There's a lot that's being done, you know, and widen and broaden the struggle and participate. Go to Palestine, go to visit Palestine. And we talked about this just before we started, you know, Israel is trying to prevent from activists to go, keep going, you know, keep going. The worst thing that'll happen is they'll send you back. But you know what? It's still worth a try, because in many cases, I know many activists, many Muslim Americans, Muslim Palestinians who are able to get in. So it's not a pleasant process, but I think it's important to visit Palestine. It's important to support Palestine like that. But there's so many different things. And like you said too earlier, it's not about not buying Israeli avocados. It's about the larger issue. It's about the larger picture. There was a great campaign now with Ramadan to boycott Israeli dates. And there is data that shows that the exports of Israeli dates has gone down considerably this year. So, I mean, these are important things that everybody can participate. And again, if there isn't a local branch in your city, in your college, start one. You know, talk to people from the college, talk to people who do have some kind of an ongoing campaign, and join them and broaden it and think and what else can be done. You know, is there an Israeli consul general or ambassador or a representative of an Israeli institution coming to speak or coming to visit or engage in any kind of collaboration with your institution, with your workplace? Make sure that that people know this is a violation of international law. So there's a great deal of work that can and needs to be done, and we all need to do it, and we all need to be engaged.
No, agreed 100%. And if you guys want to reach out to Stellenbosch PSF on Instagram, we created the society in a very contentious environment. So we definitely have some experience with that. And it just goes to show that even in the most racist, the most unjust places, there will always be a few people that have the values. Like you said, you had those values and you stood by them, even though you were raised in an environment that did not necessarily support that. And I think that that's extremely important. I think that kind of ties in the whole discussion. And I hope that we all leave with the fact that it is something that is possible, a free Palestine, a Palestine with people's human rights being respected, with political prisoners not being threatened, things like that. That is a possibility if we all commit to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, if we commit to standing up to a regime that does not respect human rights, that does not respect international law, and is not accountable to anyone. I think that like it's very disheartening to think about it, unless we think about the fact that collectively we all are part of this together. So I do want to say thank you again, Miko, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
And we will definitely be keeping in touch on our Instagram regarding this issue. But I do advise everyone to tune into Miko's. He has a webinar tomorrow evening. It's 6:30 p.m. in South African time. I'm not sure what it is in other regions, which is part 2 of the Corbyn to Sanders are Zionist organizations targeting progressive politicians. I think that actually sets a stage for us to understand how all of these things are interwebbed in politics and how we actually can get involved.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much, Miko.
Thank you. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.